Good afternoon and welcome everybody to the latest in our series of ENO Center for Transportation webinars. Today we are discussing mobility as a service with Landon Reed. Landon is a transit data specialist at the IBI Group, where he continues work that he began at Conveyal, building tools for governments and consultants to gather, manipulate, and enhance GTFS feeds for regions around the world. Landon has studied the development of open data standards and helped advocate for and educate Atlanta transportation officials on sharing data with the public, as well as other cities across the country and across the world. And while working previously at the Atlanta Regional Commission, he worked with the region's transit agencies to coordinate effective technology solutions for delivering passenger information and managing the production of GTFS. He also works on Open Trip Planner, a multimodal routing engine for regions all over across the country. And today, Landon is going to be bringing together all of his knowledge and discuss different approaches of mobility as a service platforms. We're going to have plenty of time for questions at the end. Please feel free to enter your questions in the question box on the side of the screen at any time, and we're going to get to as many of those as possible after the presentation. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Landon.
Okay, thank you so much. So I'll go ahead and jump right in since that introduction covered pretty much all of my professional life. So my presentation today is focused on mobility as a service and specifically, how to share and play nice with regard to data. So just a kind of an overview of what that looks like today. Going to first walk through a brief history of mobility data, both transit and just general mobility. Going to look at a few examples of mobility as a service in the wild. So what has kind of sprouted up in the past couple of years when we're talking about mobility as a service, and I'll kind of give some concrete examples of what that looks like. Then ask the question to share or not to share, and discuss what implications those decisions will have on communities moving forward. And I was looking back through some old presentations, and I've been talking about sharing data for a number of years now. In grad school, I was studying open data and data standards at ARC. I was advocating for open data across the region, and it's a topic that just seems to keep coming up in my life, and it's something that I find interesting and valuable. And of course, we have the toy blocks here because data is the building blocks of all the mobility products that we have in the world, and it's maybe the first thing that we learn how to share when we're younger. So looking back to 2005, I just wanted to kind of walk through a brief history of mobility data and technology, and just kind of give us some context for where we are right now. Prehistoric, before this timeline, we have MapQuest, which we all printed out directions and took them on road trips with us, and that was pretty groundbreaking. In 2005, actually, Google Maps launched, and I think became the predominant source of navigation and mobility data. And later in 2005, Google partnered with a transit agency called TriMet in Portland, Oregon, and basically came up with this data standard we call GTFS, or the General Transit Feed Specification, which became one of the big building blocks for agencies around the world that wanted to share their data, and became very important in my industry, specifically, consulting and working with data. It makes things a lot easier when you have a common data packet to kind of work with and help agencies build. So in 2007, in June, the iPhone was released, and I think a critical piece of technology on the iPhone is GPS, location technology, because that's really what's driving a lot of mobility data today, whether it's an Uber driver's mobile device in their car telling you how far they are from your location, or if you're planning a trip on the go, kind of knowing your origin. It's very important to just kind of give you convenient directions. Later in that decade, the first bike share in North America was rolled out in Washington, D.C., Capital Bike Share, and I think it was kind of a big moment for mobility data and the beginnings of mobility as a service here in the States. Moving past 2010, Uber launched in San Francisco early in that decade and grew throughout the past decade throughout the country and the world. And then we switched back to this GTFS thing that launched a few years ago, and we counted around 272 agencies with sharing their data in this GTFS format. And so had this huge explosion of data sharing. A kind of companion or sister standard called GBFS, or General Bike Share Fee Specification, was released in 2015, which really kind of opened up the world of data for bike share systems. So we had Capital Bike Share first, and now we have this data standard for sharing data. And just a couple of years ago, e-scooters kind of took the world by storm, or a few certain metropolitan areas where they're allowed. And here we are in the end of 2019, covered in scooters. So that's kind of just with regard to mobility data, how it's developed over the years. So when we're talking specifically about mobility as a service, well, it's kind of a buzzword, gets kind of thrown around. It's kind of a catch-all, but really what we're talking about is kind of a way to provide a number of different mobility services. So whether that be public transit, bike share, taxis, or TNCs, Uber and Lyft, or car rentals, under a single subscription model, and providing kind of a single platform to book and interact with and plan trips on all those services. This is just some screen grabs from WIM, which is in Helsinki, and it was one of the first services that I think really defined this topic pretty well and rolled out a service that people could use. And so this launched in 2016, and you can see they have a few different plans that you can, basically get a subscription to, and they provide you access to different levels of service for all these different mobility offerings. Another one, another kind of application that's in the wild is this trip planning application from TriMet, and this is a product that I worked on when I was previously at my old job with Conveyal, and now with IBI Group, continuing that work. And it basically allows you to plan multimodal journeys using a variety of different modes. So here in this view, we have transit and e-scooter. So you can plan a trip with a number of the different e-scooter operators that operate in the Portland area. We also have the ability to plan trips that take both TriMet, so a bus or train, and Uber, serving as the first and last mile, so that you can kind of, if you're not located near any bus stop or station, you can kind of get there in a convenient way and finish your trip on transit. And then they also have a bike share system in Portland, so this is just showing another example of that. We haven't quite reached with TriMet the whole entire booking piece, but that's something that we're looking to move forward, in the coming years with TriMet. So Another case that we can look to is Uber itself. So this is a quote from a recent article about Uber testing a new subscription service in San Francisco and Chicago that basically gives you access to Uber rides, the use of jump bikes or scooters, which Uber provides in various cities around the country and the world, and also free delivery of hamburgers and pizzas and salads, and all for the low price of $24.99 a month. So it's, I think, becoming more and more visible, this concept, this intangible concept of mobility as a service in products that we're familiar with in the States here. But as these offerings kind of expand and private companies begin to offer more and more services, I think there's a risk that a few people in this space have kind of pointed to. So as agencies have been kind of leading the charge for providing this data for mobility in the form of open data, GTFS, we're starting to see some private mobility providers try to close off the gates, as it were, and I think some people have termed this kind of a closed walled garden approach versus kind of a more open data sharing approach. And so there's this tension that's developed, especially with some actions by some of the big TNC providers, Lyft and Uber. We see some shutting off of APIs, so you can't applications that would try to pull in Uber information with transit information, with bike share information, may not be able to moving forward. And I think the question that that some people are pondering. This is a Lego Hamlet figure with a piece of data that he's looking at, to share or not to share, right? I think the argument for sharing is stronger. Obviously, private companies have an interest in keeping their data close, and we've seen that in various sectors. But cities and agencies, I think, are in a good position to ask or look for those private companies to do more sharing, because it, one, gives travelers more choice. We don't necessarily want to see monopolistic kind of mobility hegemonies kind of arise around the country, and there's a lot of risk tied up with that for travelers and cost too. We like to increase transparency as well, knowing what's happening within a mobility provider as far as the data that, or the vehicles that are out in the system. That's very important. And we also want to just enable innovation. I think having a number of different approaches to mobility as a service and offerings really just allows the cream to rise to the top. And I just chose this last piece to end on. So what you're looking at here is, on the left we have, and this is kind of perfect timing. A few days ago, one of my friends, David Pedrick, he's a student at Georgia Tech, sent me this project he had worked on, where he basically kind of mined some e-scooter data and turned it into origins and destination pairs, and then kind of modeled the paths of the scooters, or the likely paths, to determine which street segments were being used. And this has been done in other contexts as well. But I think it's an important kind of example of why it's important to keep data open, so we can do important things like plan where we need to build new infrastructure, new bike lanes, light infrastructure lanes, because it's important to know both to kind of keep people moving around the city efficiently, but also safely. Um, Atlanta, the city I live in, recently rolled out a ban on operating scooters or uh, bikes that have been permitted in basically after 9 p.m. Due to safety issues because we've had a number of deaths. So, I think it's important to know where these services are so we can keep people moving safely and, build better infrastructure for them. So with that, I'll end my presentation and open it up to questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Landon. Lots of really good information. Just as a reminder to all of our listeners, you can enter your questions in the question box on the side of your screen. Um, and I'm going to start off with a policy question for you, Landon. What policies do you think either are in place and have enabled some of this data sharing and mobility as a service development, or what do you see as barriers in terms of policies that we need or aren't in place that are really making it more difficult than you'd like it to be?
Yeah, so it has been a few years since I've, dived deep into policy, but I think really what some of the things we've seen are, where cities have been kind of restrictive in terms of, letting private mobility providers into kind of operating in their jurisdiction. I think cities sometimes are in a better position if that initial restriction is if the walls are up, so to speak, to kind of ask for or really demand uh, some level of data sharing. And so I think that's kind of a tactical approach that can be successful. I don't know if it's always a reality because sometimes these services just appear overnight and it can be challenging to cope with. But I think the safety piece is a really compelling argument for making sure that you know operators are providing data so that people stay safe out there.
Yep. Great. And there's a couple people asking if you can dive a little bit into a definition of mobility as a service. And there's some specific questions about does there have to be some sort of subscription model? Does it have to be multimodal? What kinds of technologies are you assuming are integrated? Can you talk a little bit more about that, the broad topic?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's kind of um, a messy set of definitions that exist, but in my view, I would say um, generally, kind of the subscription model it is most kind of synonymous with mobility as a service, where like a monthly pass for a transit agency, you would have a monthly pass for a few different types of modes. So multimodality is kind of built into that as well. Whether it gives you access to a bike share system or to take trips on the bus or train, or you can for longer trips hop in a car. I think those are kind of two critical elements, and I think the technology piece, you know, because so many of these services are reliant on location technology. I think having some way to book those services often entails having a mobile device that and an account to quickly do that. But I don't know if it's necessarily precluding systems that don't have a mobile device tied in. Maybe a card-based system would kind of meet that definition as well. So yeah, I think it's kind of it depends definitely, but
Yeah, there's lots of different models out there right now.
mm-hmm.
Um, so if we are aiming towards having data, open data standards, and some sort of standard across different, modes or agencies or companies, um, who who should be responsible for helping coordinate that and then really sort of developing and maintaining data standards, which is a lot of work.
Yeah.
Where do you see that responsibility lying?
Yeah, that is, to me, that seems like it can often, be the downfall of a data specification or attempt to share data. I think so with GTFS, we had this case where a private company and a public agency just kind of put out basically a minimum viable product that kind of worked for Google and was easy for TriMet to do. There may have been, I wasn't privy to all the negotiations there, but I think kind of a pragmatic approach kind of won the day in that case. And once it was opened up to the broader public, there was an opportunity for a number of agencies and consumers of the data, often developers or private companies, to kind of come together and continue that kind of partnered approach, but on a broader scale. With GBFS, I think it's also been kind of a collaborative approach between bike share providers and developers. So I don't know if the forum always exists for something like that, especially when we're talking about a transportation network company like Uber or Lyft. I don't know if necessarily there's going to be a data standard for integrating with those services, especially when you have two kind of predominant companies in the marketplace. But I think just opening up the data and kind of making sure that different platforms and jurisdictions can make use of it is kind of the a good baseline to strive for, where in cases where we don't have a good body to regulate those standards.
Great. There's a couple questions here about a company that you mentioned called WIM. Can you talk a little bit more about sort of the development and growth, or not growth, of that company in terms of, do you know how popular it is? Are a lot of people using it? And what changes have we seen over time?
So I don't have a ton of details on WIM. It's basically grew up in Helsinki, and I wish I had more experience with that system, but it's really, I just mentioned it because it is kind of one of the initial services that kind of grew up and kind of sprouted a lot of the interest in mobility as a service. But yeah, it hasn't folded yet, so I think that's a good indication that there's at least a business model that is working for now. But I think if we were asking questions about Uber too, right? There's a there's a valid question to be asked about business model and whether it's sustainable, or what technologies have to as far as autonomous vehicles have to kind of enter the marketplace before it can really take a foothold and become a long-term service that consumers can make use of.
Yep. Um, There's a question here. This is a hard one, and I don't know the answer. I don't know if you
Sure.
will.
Okay.
Um, do you know of any studies that have looked at the use of mobility as a service systems in different areas, and if that has had any impact on mode choice? So is there, any reduced vehicle use if you have these sort of platforms that enable more multimodal travel? Um, do you know if there's any studies around that and what the impacts are or might be?
I don't, but I would, yeah, really love to read one and see, because I think the perception uh, generally is that um, you know there are these entirely new networks of vehicles and services that um, vehicular and non-vehicular, that are available for people, and we know that um, some of the, or we can reasonably assume that some of the vehicle services like Uber and Lyft have taken away mode share from public transit, but are some of the micromobility services counterbalancing that? Um, you know, I haven't seen a study kind of looking at a mobility as a service platform, and then trying to understand the effects. But um, yeah, no, I'm curious to know too.
Great. Well, if anybody knows, please do email us, and Landon and I will both interestingly read the studies. I'm going to do one more question. Uh, as we see companies such as these TNCs having these walled gardens that make the open data that will enable mobility as a service more difficult. Um, if this is something that doesn't change, what do you see happening to mobility as a service? Do you think it will sort of keep going the same direction it is, or a different direction, or is it going to totally sort of phase out as something that we're never able to fully achieve?
Um, yeah, I, I think there's a strong likelihood that um, you know I think it depends largely in part on what some of these giant companies that offer um, ride sharing do in the next few years. I think a lot of um, the power in the marketplace kind of sits with them. Transit agencies in particular, um, can only kind of negotiate and bargain and so much. So I think without any kind of real uh, regulation on the kinds of data that is shared and made available to the public, you'll probably see just a kind of further consolidation of these services in kind of more monopolistic style platforms. So, and at that point, it becomes pitting one giant against another, and I'm not really sure what will happen there. But yeah, I think we're at a time that we we can only really guess what's going to happen the next few years, and um, I think we have to kind of be more forceful in some ways about um, what our agencies are looking to uh, get out of these enterprises that are using our public roads and already using all of our public transit data that's been made available for a number of years. I think it's important to know uh, what kind of services are out there and where people are traveling so that we can better plan for our infrastructure.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Landon, for joining us and for all of your expertise. Thank you, everybody, for listening in and for all of your great questions. Um, We will be posting a video of this webinar and the slides on our website, enotrans.org, which I would also encourage you to visit. You can look at our previous webinars and sign up for Eno Transportation Weekly, which is our weekly newsletter, a valuable resource on all things transportation. Thank you all again, and have a great afternoon.